total televised execution of Adam Schiff's political career was about to commence, and Senator John Kennedy had not even reached for the brass latches of his battered briefcase. Inside the high-voltage perimeter of ABC's Manhattan studio at exactly 10:00 Mr. Eastern, the air was suffocatingly thick with the toxic tribal electricity of a fractured republic. 3 massive robotic broadcast cameras prowled silently along their curved steel tracks, their red tally lights glowing like predatory eyes as they framed the iconic crescent table and a studio gallery packed to absolute capacity. 300 fiercely progressive Manhattan women sat practically vibrating with anticipation, die-hard partisans who had happily endured the freezing dawn winds on Columbus Avenue just to secure front-row seats for what they assumed would be a one-sided political slaughter. Holding absolute, unquestioned court at the apex of the arena was 69-year-old Whoopi Goldberg. With her hair pulled tight and her signature reading glasses suspended like a badge of office on a delicate chain, she radiated the ironclad sovereignty of daytime television royalty. Flanking her left was Joy Behar, comfortably entrenched in her 28th year on that very couch, a woman whose entire broadcasting legacy relied on launching crowd-pleasing, comedic mortar shells at Republicans. She fundamentally lacked the ability to pick out of a standard police lineup. Anchoring the right was Sunny Hostin, a razor-sharp former federal prosecutor harboring the icy, calculating gaze of the only woman at the desk who had ever actually gutted a hostile witness in a federal courtroom, buffered only by Sarah Haynes, the designated moderate strategically inserted by anxious network executives for a fleeting illusion of ideological balance. But the true, suffocating gravity of the room belonged entirely to the 2 men seated in the premier guest chairs. Occupying the seat of honor was 65-year-old Senator Adam Schiff, practically weaponizing the manicured arrogance of an untouchable Washington insider. Armored in a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal 3-piece suit offset by a shimmering light blue silk tie, Schiff played the conquering, morally superior statesman to absolute chilling perfection. His stage props were arranged with surgical precision. A heavy, elite Mont Blanc fountain pen he had wielded for 23 years lay casually beside his water bottle, resting perfectly flush against 3 freshly printed, heavily promoted copies of his new memoir, strategically angled for the optimal camera cover shot. And yet, seated directly to his right, radiating a terrifying, completely unbothered stillness, was 74-year-old Senator John Kennedy. The Louisianan was swallowed in a severely faded, rumpled charcoal suit that looked exactly as if it had been violently crushed inside the overhead bin of a cramped 5:30 a.m. Delta flight out of New Orleans. He sat in dead, unblinking silence as Schiff arrogantly branded him a fascist enabling relic to millions of live viewers, merely peering impassively over his low-riding, wire-rimmed glasses while casually adjusting a necktie his wife had handed him the night before. The slick California congressman was smiling triumphantly for the monitors, fundamentally unaware that the lethal instruments of his own political demise were currently resting inches away on the studio floor, wedged quietly between Kennedy's scuffed leather shoes. It was a severely scarred, ancient leather satchel, the exact same unyielding briefcase the country lawyer had dragged into every brutal Capitol Hill cross-examination since the Obama era, and it sat waiting in the shadows, locked and loaded with the devastating federal receipts that were about to tear a Washington legacy to absolute shreds. The segment commenced with Goldberg deploying the specific, practiced warmth a daytime host inherently reserves for guests she is absolutely certain will generate viral, highly entertaining television. "Senators, welcome to The View," she announced smoothly, setting the stage for the highly anticipated political theater. Today, we are talking about accountability in Washington. Senator Schiff, your new book is climbing the charts. Tell us why you wrote it. Schiff's face immediately relaxed into a deeply practiced, media-ready smile. He confidently retrieved a copy of his memoir, holding it aloft so the studio lighting and the zooming broadcast cameras could capture the jacket design perfectly. "Whoopi, thank you," Schiff began, his voice dropping into the grave, highly rehearsed register of a politician delivering a solemn warning. "I wrote this book because the country is at a turning point. We have a fascist movement in this country, not a future fascist movement, a present one." Schiff's rhetoric escalated rapidly, his words flowing with the polished cadence of a man who had flawlessly delivered these exact lines on 40 different television sets over the past 18 months. Donald Trump is the Mussolini of Mar-a-Lago. He has taken over the Republican Party. He has weaponized the Department of Justice against his political enemies. He is sending the National Guard against American children at the border. He has stripped our intelligence community of every honest professional and replaced them with loyalists. We are living the fall of a republic in real time. The studio audience immediately erupted into rapturous applause. Schiff paused expertly, allowing the wave of progressive adulation to wash over the set before settling back into his narrative rhythm. My book is the story of how we fought back: the first impeachment, the Russia investigation, the defense of our democratic institutions against an authoritarian and his enablers, he declared, executing a slow, deliberate turn in his guest chair. Tellingly, Schiff completely refused to make eye contact with Kennedy seated beside him. Instead, he locked his intense gaze directly on Goldberg. And Whoopi, speaking of enablers, I want to be honest with the audience today, Schiff continued, his tone sharpening into a surgical partisan strike. I am surprised, genuinely surprised, that the network thought it appropriate to put me on the same stage as the gentleman to my right. Goldberg's eyebrows shot upward in exaggerated broadcast surprise, while the live studio audience leaned physically forward in their seats, sensing the impending political bloodletting. Senator Kennedy is a relic, Schiff proclaimed, his voice echoing cleanly through the cavernous Manhattan studio, a relic of a Louisiana that no longer exists in the year 2026. He affects a folksy accent that is charitably a costume. He pretends to be a country lawyer who happened into the Senate by accident. He is, in fact, a graduate of Vanderbilt and Oxford, and he has spent his entire career using the disguise of folksy ignorance to advance the most extreme positions of his party. Joy Behar, practically vibrating with partisan validation, pointed an accusatory finger directly at Kennedy and loudly agreed, "That's right." In the front row, two women enthusiastically whooped in agreement as Schiff aggressively doubled down. He has called for the prosecution of teachers. He has called for the deportation of children. He has voted against every climate measure in the last decade. He has voted to gut Medicaid 4 times. Schiff listed, his words hitting like a rapid-fire prosecutor's indictment. He is in every meaningful way an enabler of the fascism Donald Trump represents. He is on the wrong side of history, and the country will remember that when the history books are written. Finally, Schiff rotated his body to look directly at the older man from Louisiana. "Senator, with respect, you should be embarrassed to share this stage with me," Schiff stated, his eyes cold and unyielding. "The voters of Louisiana sent you here. The voters of California sent me here. They are not the same country. They will not be remembered the same way." The audience essentially exploded, cheering wildly at the blistering condemnation. Goldberg, ever the masterful conductor of daytime drama, let the raw applause run for 10 full, uninterrupted seconds before finally raising a hand to quiet the room. "Senator Kennedy," she prompted, shifting the spotlight, "your response." Kennedy did not rush. He casually adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with a single, unhurried index finger. He completely ignored Schiff's physical presence, directing his incredibly slow, impossibly thick, syrup-like Southern drawl entirely toward the host. "Ma'am, I appreciate the welcome, Kennedy began quietly, his voice an absolute contrast to Schiff's frantic political velocity. Senator Schiff over there reminds me of an alligator I had once. Kennedy paused. An agonizingly long beat of pure country timing. Real talker right up till the moment I started counting his teeth. The massive studio went profoundly quiet for a split second before a single involuntary bark of laughter erupted from the back row. That single laugh acted as a pressure valve. Suddenly, a row in the middle broke, and then 30 people were audibly chuckling at the sheer absurdity of the deeply Southern analogy, cutting through the tense Manhattan air. Goldberg's face underwent a sudden, involuntary transformation, something it had not visibly done on live television in 3 years, as it broke into a genuine, highly surprised smile. Slowly, methodically, Kennedy reached down between his scuffed shoes and hoisted his beaten-up leather briefcase squarely onto his lap. Now, whoopee, Senator Schiff has a book to sell. I respect that. I write a book every couple years myself. Kennedy drawled amiably, his tone deceptively conversational. But before we talk about his book, I think we ought to talk about something the publisher left out of the back cover. With deliberate theatricality, Kennedy hoisted the worn leather case and set it firmly onto the polished wood of the curved studio table. The heavy leather made a distinct, dull thud against the hard surface. His thumbs found the brass latches, and the microphone picked up 2 incredibly loud metallic clicks that echoed sharply in the sudden, tense quiet that had swallowed the fading laughter. Let's talk about Senator Schiff's houses, Kennedy announced smoothly. The carefully constructed, media-ready smile on Schiff's face instantly faltered. The expensive Mont Blanc pen, resting lightly between Schiff's thumb and forefinger, betrayed his internal spike of adrenaline, tapping nervously twice against the tabletop. The political dynamics of the broadcast were actively inverting. The self-proclaimed country lawyer had just opened Pandora's box live on a daytime talk show, and the progressive champion was suddenly realizing he was the one actively under investigation. Kennedy bypassed the primary documents and instead pulled a thick blue folder from the depths of the case. The imposing seal stamped on the front cover read in stark, undeniable lettering, transcripts, Public Television Archive 2017 to 2020. He laid the blue folder completely flat on the curved table, deliberately leaving it unopened, forcing the heavy silence to stretch for 3 excruciatingly long seconds while the cameras zoomed in tight. Senator Schiff, between January of 2017 and April of 2020, you appeared on national television approximately 247 times to discuss the Russia investigation, Kennedy stated, his voice devoid of any previous folksy warmth, replaced by the precise cadence of a prosecuting attorney laying out a timeline. I am not counting radio. I am not counting podcasts, just television. Kennedy finally flipped the folder open. On at least 53 of those appearances, you stated in some form that you had personally seen evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. He slowly extracted the first crisp sheet of transcribed paper. March 20th, 2017. Meet the press. Chuck Todd asked, if you have evidence beyond circumstantial, you say, quote, there is evidence that is not circumstantial and it's very much worthy of investigation, end quote. Without waiting for a breath, Kennedy pulled the next document. Next transcript. December 17th, 2017. CNN, Jake Tapper. Quote, the most palpable evidence of collusion, end quote. The rhythm was punishing. Next. March 22nd, 2018. MSNBC, Rachel Maddow. Quote, we have direct evidence that I cannot disclose at this time, end quote. Kennedy let 3 more identical transcripts pass through his fingers without even reading them aloud, simply dropping them with quiet finality onto the growing pile of paper. Senator, you used the word evidence in connection with collusion 53 times across 3 years on national television, Kennedy summarized, his eyes burning over the top rims of his glasses. You did so as the ranking Democrat on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, a position that gave you access to classified material no other member of Congress had access to. The American people watched you on their televisions, and they trusted you because you said you had seen the evidence. Kennedy calmly set the entire stack of transcripts down. Then, in April of 2019, Special Counsel Robert Mueller, Republican, FBI Director under George W. Bush, decorated Marine, combat veteran of Vietnam, released his final report, Kennedy noted, leaning forward slightly. 448 pages, 2.5 years of investigation. $32 million, 45 FBI agents, 3,000 subpoenas, 500 witnesses. Kennedy retrieved a single, devastatingly simple page, the conclusion, quote, "The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities," end quote. The massive Manhattan studio was entirely devoid of sound. Senator, did not establish is the legal phrase used by federal prosecutors when they have looked at the evidence and determined that no crime can be charged, Kennedy explained, delivering a masterclass in constitutional law right to the table. It is the strongest negative finding a prosecutor can make. Schiff reflexively opened his mouth to deploy a defense, but Kennedy aggressively raised a single commanding finger, instantly halting the interruption. "Now hold on, Senator, I ain't done," Kennedy commanded. Because 4 years later, in May of 2023, Special Counsel John Durham, also Republican, also a career federal prosecutor, released his report on the origins of the Russia probe. The investigation that you went on television 53 times to defend, Kennedy smoothly pulled the official Durham conclusion document. Quote, "The Crossfire Hurricane investigation was opened on raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence," end quote, Kennedy read, pausing to let the weight of the federal findings settle. Quote, "The FBI failed to uphold its mission of strict fidelity to the law," end quote. Kennedy let that damning sentence hang in the air even longer. Senator, you had access to that intelligence. You sat on the House Intelligence Committee. You read the Crossfire Hurricane file. You read the Steele dossier, which, according to the FBI's own internal review released in 2020, contained material that could not be verified and that the FBI knew could not be verified, Kennedy stated, his voice laced with absolute moral conviction. You knew the foundation was raw and uncorroborated, and you went on television 53 times and told the American people the foundation was solid. Schiff desperately attempted to seize control of the spiraling narrative. Senator, the Mueller report did document numerous contacts between Russians and the Trump campaign. Schiff countered rapidly, his voice straining. The report did not exonerate. Kennedy cut him down with surgical precision. Senator, did not establish. Those are Mueller's own words. He chose them carefully. He had 2.5 years to find a charge, and he could not. Kennedy fired back. And Senator, between April of 2019, when Mueller's report came out, and today, you have appeared on national television approximately 186 more times to discuss the Russia matter. On 0 of those appearances did you say, quote, "I was wrong about the evidence," end quote. 0. The pressure in the studio was palpable as Schiff's anxiety manifested physically. His manicured fingers were now rapidly twisting the cap of his expensive Mont Blanc pen on and off, in a repetitive, self-soothing loop. Kennedy effortlessly reached for one final sheet from the blue folder. "Now, Senator, I want to talk about somebody who used to be your friend on television," Kennedy said softly. "The man who put you on his show 41 times between 2017 and 2020. The man who never once challenged your evidence. The man who agreed with every theory you advanced. Who is that, Senator Schiff?" Schiff swallowed hard. I assume you mean Jake Tapper," Schiff stammered uncomfortably. "Senator of CNN." 41 primetime interviews. The man who liberals trusted to be tougher on Trump than anyone. The man who hosts The Lead every weekday afternoon, Kennedy confirmed, sliding the final sheet forward. Senator, on May 17, 2023, 6 days after the Durham report dropped, Jake Tapper sat in the same chair where he had hosted you 41 times. And he looked into the camera and he said, quote, "The Durham report is devastating for the FBI," end quote. Kennedy set the paper down with finality. Senator Jake Tapper, CNN, your favorite anchor, your most loyal platform, used the word devastating about the investigation you spent 3 years defending. Kennedy stared directly at Schiff over the rims of his glasses, his eyes piercing. Senator, when Jake Tapper says you were wrong, the country has stopped pretending. Sonny Hostin, the hardened former federal prosecutor sitting at the table, actively winced at the inescapable logic. The broadcast cameras immediately caught her visceral reaction, knowing she had personally appeared on Tapper's highly rated show 17 times. Joy Behar, seemingly unable to process the destruction of the narrative, stared blankly at the studio floor. Beside Kennedy, the physical toll of the cross-examination broke through the Mont Blanc pen, literally rolled out of Schiff's suddenly slick grip, though he frantically managed to catch it before it plummeted completely off the table. Without missing a beat, Kennedy produced the third folder, a stark green cover emblazoned with the imposing seal of the United States House of Representatives. The crisp title read clearly, Resolution 437, censuring Adam B. Schiff. Senator, the Mueller investigation cost the American taxpayer $32 million, Kennedy stated, shifting the brutal interrogation from theoretical politics to hard economics. That figure is cited in the censure resolution that the United States House of Representatives passed against you on June 21, 2023. Bipartisan number, not in dispute. Kennedy pulled the official, heavily stamped cost analysis document. $32 million. Senator, I want to put that in terms that the folks watching this show today can feel. He laid the paper down and turned his full, unblinking attention toward the 300 progressive women sitting in the live studio audience. The Federal Reserve Bank publishes a survey every year about American household finances, Kennedy explained, his tone suddenly incredibly grounded, speaking directly to the harsh realities of everyday survival. The most recent one, released 2 months ago, found that 63% of American households cannot afford a $400 emergency expense. 63%, not a $4,000 emergency. A $400 emergency, a flat tire, a broken refrigerator, a trip to the dentist. Slowly, deliberately, Kennedy reached into the breast pocket of his faded suit jacket and extracted a small, profoundly beat-up pocket calculator. It was exactly the kind of battered, antiquated electronic device an old-school country lawyer would proudly carry because he inherently distrusted using his modern smartphone for essential mathematics while standing in front of rolling cameras. $32 million divided by $400 apiece equals, Kennedy mumbled, his thick fingers aggressively punching the faded plastic buttons. He held up the small digital display so the tight camera angle could capture the gray LCD digits, 80,000. He let the massive number echo in the silent room. 80,000 American working families. That is how many $400 emergencies could have been weathered with the money the Mueller probe spent. Kennedy's voice began to rise with genuine, righteous indignation. 80,000 mamas who could have replaced the refrigerator that died in August. 80,000 daddies who could have fixed the truck so they could get to the job site Monday morning. 80,000 emergency room visits that would not have ended in collection notices. He placed the tiny calculator down beside the devastating mountain of federal records. And Senator, those 80,000 families paid for that money out of their paychecks, out of their tax returns, out of the dollars that did not buy school clothes for their kids in August. Schiff, his composure shattering, lunged verbally in a desperate attempt to sever his connection to the astronomical financial waste. Senator, the investigation was independent. I did not control the budget, the cost. Schiff pleaded, his voice thin and defensive. Kennedy leaned in, his physical presence dominating the table. Senator, you did not control the budget, but you launched the narrative. Kennedy corrected instantly, his tone echoing with absolute finality. You sat on the Intelligence Committee. You had the access. You went on television 53 times. You created the political pressure that made the investigation politically necessary. Without your 53 TV appearances, the Mueller probe does not happen. It does not last 2.5 years. It does not cost $32 million. You made it happen. With your words, with your evidence that did not exist. The studio audience, 300 passionately progressive Manhattan women, sat utterly paralyzed, completely frozen in their seats. The unfolding story had bypassed abstract partisan politics entirely. It was now viscerally about money. It was deeply, intimately about the terror of the $400 emergency, a universal working-class panic they implicitly understood. Many of them had lived that precise panic. Kennedy subtly shifted his broad shoulders toward the head of the table. Whoopi, I want to ask the audience something, Kennedy requested politely. The folks in this room, the folks watching at home in Iowa and Ohio and Pennsylvania, y'all know who paid for that $32 million? He turned his gaze squarely into the red light of the primary broadcast camera. Y'all paid for it out of your paychecks. Senator Schiff did not pay for it. The Russian government did not pay for it. Robert Mueller did not pay for it. You paid for it. In the heavily progressive audience, a woman seated in the third row, her face tight with sudden, undeniable realization, nodded slowly in profound agreement. The roaming broadcast cameras instantly immortalized her quiet rebellion. Kennedy rotated back, locking his eyes onto Schiff's pale, deteriorating visage. Senator, I want to ask you a simple question, Kennedy demanded softly. When did you intend to give the American people their $32 million back? Absolute agonizing silence descended upon the studio. Senator, not the principle, the money. When were you going to pay it back? Kennedy pushed relentlessly, his tone sharpening into a blade. Out of the $870,000 Maryland house? Out of the Burbank condominium? Out of the book, Advance from Lessons from the Brink? Senator, when were the 80,000 mamas who could have fixed their refrigerators going to get their money back? Schiff possessed absolutely no answer. The physical manifestation of his utter defeat was instantaneous and highly visible. The pristine Mont Blanc pen, the symbol of his elite Washington status, violently rolled directly out of his visibly trembling hand. It bounced once, sharply, on the hard, curved wood of the broadcast table. It rolled aggressively across 3 feet of polished surface, teetered momentarily on the sharp edge, and plummeted to the studio floor with a sharp, distinctly audible click. The microphone array captured the pathetic sound perfectly as the expensive cylinder rolled click, click, click across the polished hardwood, traveling 3 feet, then 4 feet, then 5 feet, before finally coming to a dead, humiliating rest directly underneath Whoopi Goldberg's host chair. Goldberg peered down at the lost pen, then looked back up at the paralyzed, silent form of Senator Schiff. The cameras, operated by seasoned professionals smelling television history, refused to cut away, holding the excruciating wide shot. Goldberg physically bent down, retrieved the sleek black pen from the floor, and extended it across the table toward Schiff like a peace offering. Schiff reached for his prized possession, but his outstretched hand was shaking so violently, so uncontrollably, that he physically could not grip the smooth resin barrel. Defeated by his own failing neurology, Schiff was forced to simply lay the pen flat on the table directly in front of him. His other trembling hand retreated instantly into his lap, hidden safely out of view of the merciless broadcast cameras, leaving the pen abandoned on the polished wood, where his paralyzed fingers simply could not retrieve it. The devastating theater of accountability continued to escalate as Kennedy laid his hand firmly upon the fourth folder, a stark, alarming red. The cover bore a simple, devastating title, H-Res 437, Censure. Senator. June 21, 2023. The United States House of Representatives, by a vote of 213 to 209, formally censured you, Kennedy began, his voice taking on the grave, sonorous resonance of a constitutional historian. You stood in the well of the House. Speaker Kevin McCarthy read the resolution aloud. You were rebuked on the official record of the United States Congress for, quote, misleading the American public, end quote. Kennedy lifted the highly official, multi-page resolution into the bright studio lights. You are the 25th member of the United States House of Representatives ever censured since 1789, 236 years of American history. 25 names. You are one of them. He paused, letting the crushing weight of historical infamy settle over the desk. Now, Senator, when you walked back to your seat after the censure, the Democrats clapped for you. They cheered, you smiled. And in the hallway, after you spoke to reporters, and you said, and I quote, I will wear this as a badge of honor, end quote. Kennedy lowered the document, his sharp eyes pinning Schiff to his chair. Senator, a badge of honor. Kennedy let the repulsive phrase hang suspended in the silent air. Senator, the other 24 members of the United States House of Representatives who were censured in the history of this country, you know what they did? Kennedy asked, his tone dripping with quiet outrage. He deliberately turned to a specific page. Number 23, Senator Joseph McCarthy, December 2nd, 1954, censured for abusing his Senate privileges to make wild accusations about communist infiltration he could not prove. Kennedy looked up sharply over his glasses, his eyes entirely devoid of any residual Southern charm. Senator Joseph McCarthy, censured for, quote, making wild accusations he could not prove, end quote. Senator Schiff, you were censured for the exact same reason. 69 years apart. The historical company you keep, sir, is Joseph McCarthy. The absolute shockwave rippling through the studio was visceral. Joy Behar had self-righteously weaponized the loaded words McCarthy and McCarthyism on this exact set. Sonny Hostin had actually fact-checked the statistic during a previous commercial break, confirming Behar had used the term at least 40 times in 15 years, inevitably directing the slur exclusively at conservative Republicans. Now, faced with the irrefutable congressional record linking her progressive hero directly to the infamous demagogue, Behar could do nothing but desperately stare into the dark depths of her coffee cup. Kennedy was far from finished. And, Senator, there is one other name on the censure list I want to ask you about. Kennedy continued mercilessly. Number 24, the person whose name appears immediately above yours. The name that comes right before Schiff on the list. Do you remember who that was? Schiff barely managed to whisper a response. I. Representative Gosar Schiff croaked, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. Paul Gosar, Republican, Arizona, Kennedy confirmed loudly, projecting the facts into the quiet room. Censured November 17th, 2021, for posting a cartoon video the Democratic majority described as a depiction of violence against another member of Congress. Kennedy smoothly extracted a separate, clearly marked sheet, the official congressional record from November 17, 2021. Senator, do you remember who led the floor debate against Paul Gosar? Kennedy asked. Absolute, suffocating silence. You did, Senator. Kennedy answered his own question, reading directly from the unyielding federal text. You stood at the well of the House on November 17, 2021. You said, and I quote from the congressional record, "The conduct of Representative Gosar dishonors this institution. We must hold every member accountable regardless of party. The integrity of this body depends on it." End quote. Kennedy placed the paper perfectly atop the growing mountain of undeniable evidence. You voted for Paul Gosar's censure, Senator. You called it a defense of the integrity of the House. And 19 months later, June 21st, 2023, you stood at that exact same well of the House, and the institution you said depended on accountability censured you, Kennedy summarized, his words falling like hammer blows. 25th name, right under Gosar's. Same list, same well, same shame. The studio, packed tight with 300 passionate women, possessed the heavy, breathless acoustics of a grand library. A woman situated in the 6th row, early 60s, wearing her silver hair pulled cleanly back, sporting a faded "I'm with her" campaign pin that she had resolutely lacked the heart to remove from her jacket for 9 long years, audibly gasped, "Oh." The Mont Blanc pen lay abandoned and useless on the curved desk. Schiff's hands were completely immobilized in his lap. The physical manifestation of his utter political destruction meant he simply could not generate the motor control required to pick the object up. "Senator, a badge of honor," Kennedy repeated softly, shaking his head in sheer disgust. You stood in the same well where you had condemned Paul Gosar. You took the same rebuke from the same institution for the same kind of conduct, and you called it a badge of honor. Kennedy snapped the red folder completely shut. "Now, Senator, we are going to talk about one more thing," Kennedy announced, his voice dropping an octave, signaling the final, lethal phase of the live interrogation. The thing that put you on the censure list in the first place. The thing you did on the floor of the United States House of Representatives on September 26, 2019. Kennedy finally moved to the 5th and final folder. It was stark black, its cover completely unmarked, exuding an aura of undeniable finality. Kennedy purposefully did not open it immediately, letting the psychological anticipation suffocate the desk. Senator, September 26, 2019, the first day of public hearings before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence regarding the impeachment inquiry of President Donald J. Hast, Trump, Kennedy stated slowly, setting the historic scene. You were the chairman. You held the gavel. The cameras were on. C-SPAN was carrying live. Schiff stared sightlessly down at the polished wood of the table, his posture entirely defeated. Senator, you opened the hearing with a recitation. You said you were going to read into the record the contents of the phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine, the phone call at the heart of the impeachment inquiry. Kennedy deliberately laid the black folder open. You read it slowly. You read it dramatically. You read it for several minutes. You said the president had said, "I have a favor I want from you, though, and I'm going to say this only 7 times, so you better listen good." End quote. Kennedy's voice was sharp with contempt. You said the president had said, quote, "Make up dirt on my political opponent, lots of it," end quote. You said the president had said, quote, "Understand, lots of it, on this and on that," end quote. You read these words to the American people as the chairman of the impeachment inquiry, with C-SPAN carrying live. He set the damning transcript page down flat and smoothly pulled out a second sheet. Senator, the actual transcript of the phone call released by the White House on September 25th, 2019, the day before your hearing, does not contain any of those words, Kennedy revealed, holding the official document aloft. He began reading the legitimate, verified text. The actual transcript shows the president saying, quote, "I would like you to do us a favor, though," end quote. Kennedy stared over the paper. That is what he said. 8 words. The president did not say, "Make up dirt." The president did not say, "I'm going to say this only 7 times." The president did not say, "Lots of it." You made those words up, Senator. Kennedy's voice rang out with absolute, irrefutable clarity. You wrote dialogue. You delivered fictional quotes under the cover of congressional privilege to the American people on C-SPAN from the chairman's seat of the impeachment inquiry. Inside the studio, the 300 progressive Manhattan women were visibly grappling with profound cognitive dissonance. Many of them had watched that historic impeachment hearing broadcast live. Many of them had literally cheered from their living rooms for Schiff's aggressive theatrical performance that very night. Now, trapped under the blazing studio lights, they were forcefully watching their own deeply held political memories be aggressively rewritten in real time by the relentless presentation of hard evidence. Kennedy pulled a third, final page from the black folder. Senator, when Republicans confronted you on the same day, within hours of your fictional reading, you said, and I quote your exact words from the floor, "It was meant to be, at least in part, a parody," end quote. Kennedy slowly lifted his eyes, the sheer absurdity of the defense etched into his weathered features. A parody. He let the fundamentally unserious word sit suspended in the gravity of the room. Senator, the transcript of a phone call that became the basis of impeaching the President of the United States, the third presidential impeachment in American history, the constitutional crisis of 2019. And your contribution as chairman of the inquiry was a parody, made-up fiction read into the official record. Schiff, his voice trembling with desperation, attempted one final, incredibly weak deflection. Senator, that was clearly framed as commentary, Schiff stammered, his words completely devoid of their usual polished arrogance. Kennedy leaned forward, his presence overwhelming the physical space between them. Senator, the American people watching C-SPAN that morning did not know it was a parody. Kennedy shot back, his voice thick with absolute disgust. You did not announce it as a parody. You read it as the contents of a real phone call. You used the chairman's authority. You used the dignity of the House Intelligence Committee. You used the cover of congressional privilege to deliver fictional quotes about the President of the United States to launch an impeachment that would cost the American taxpayer $27 million. Kennedy viciously pulled the final concluding document. And, Senator, the censure resolution against you in 2023, Resolution 437, the official document that put your name on the list with Joseph McCarthy and Paul Gosar. It cites specifically the parody transcript of September 26, 2019, as one of the 4 reasons for your censure. Kennedy slapped the page firmly onto the table. Senator, the conduct that put you in the history books with Joe McCarthy was that you wrote fictional dialogue and read it into the record of the United States Congress to launch an impeachment of a sitting president. You did this on C-SPAN with cameras rolling as the chairman of the inquiry. Kennedy snapped the black folder definitively shut. Senator, I am going to ask the audience, the folks in this room, to think about something. Kennedy proposed pivoting his body toward the stunned crowd. What does the country call a man who writes fake dialogue and presents it as the words of the President of the United States in an official congressional proceeding to launch the impeachment of that president? He paused, allowing the question to permeate the room. In Louisiana, we have a word for that, Kennedy noted dryly. It has 2 syllables, starts with F. For the first time all morning, the audience absolutely did not laugh at his folksy delivery. The audience knew exactly what word he meant. Some of the women literally raised their trembling hands to cover their shocked mouths. Joy Behar, the veteran host who had aggressively and unconditionally defended every single one of Schiff's numerous television appearances for 6 long years, sat frozen, staring fixedly at the promotional photograph of Schiff that was still ironically glowing on the large studio monitor directly behind the table. She absolutely refused to look at the broken man himself. The Mont Blanc pen simply sat undisturbed on the curved table, entirely out of reach. Schiff was making absolutely no physical attempt to retrieve it, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. The dramatic climax arrived precisely as Kennedy deliberately left the 5 distinct folders, brown, blue, green, red, black, splayed open and entirely visible across the curved wood, a damning visual mosaic perfectly framed for the roaming broadcast cameras. Senator Schiff, I am going to ask you 3 simple yes or no questions, Kennedy announced, his voice taking on the grim, inescapable authority of a judge issuing a final ruling. The American people deserve answers. The folks watching this show, the folks watching at home, they deserve a yes or a no. Whoopi Goldberg, despite her role as the commanding anchor of the desk, made absolutely no move to interrupt the interrogation. Sunny Hostin, the veteran prosecutor, sat impossibly still, her eyes locked on the unfolding legal execution. Question 1, Kennedy commanded. Senator, did you sign federal mortgage documents claiming Maryland was your primary residence, while at the same time claiming California was your primary residence on state tax forms? The heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the studio. Senator, yes or no? Schiff's mouth opened, his voice barely a terrified whisper. I cannot. The matter is under. Schiff choked out. Kennedy slammed the trap shut. Yes or no, Senator? Schiff completely shut down, refusing to answer. Question 2. Kennedy pressed relentlessly. Senator, did you go on national television 53 times saying you had seen evidence of Russian collusion that the Mueller report and the Durham report concluded did not exist? Complete silence enveloped the room once more. Senator, yes or no? Schiff managed a desperate, fragmented defense. Senator, the Mueller report documented numerous. The report did not exonerate. Schiff pleaded softly. Kennedy's response was cold steel. Senator, the question is whether the evidence existed. The special counsel said did not establish. That is a no. Did you say on television it existed? Yes or no? Schiff visibly swallowed, completely unable to form an answer, retreating into absolute silence. Question 3. Kennedy stated, delivering the final fatal blow. Senator, on September 26, 2019, did you read fictional dialogue into the official record of the House Intelligence Committee, presenting it as the contents of a phone call between 2 sitting presidents to launch an impeachment that cost the American taxpayer $27 million? The studio, holding 300 spellbound women, was as quiet as a grave. The primary broadcast camera zoomed incredibly tight, locking intensely onto Schiff's pale, sweating face. Senator, yes or no? Schiff said absolutely nothing. The black Mont Blanc pen sat tauntingly on the polished table. His hands remained securely trapped in his lap. His head was bowed downward, his chin nearly resting on his chest. Goldberg waited a professional, agonizing 5 seconds, allowing the incredible silence to broadcast to millions of households. Then 10 seconds. Then 15 excruciating seconds. Finally, the veteran host turned gracefully toward the primary camera lens. Senator Schiff, would you like to respond to the 3 questions? Whoopi inquired, her tone stripped of all its previous partisan warmth. Schiff completely refused to look up from the table. Senator, nothing? She pressed gently. Senator Schiff, would you like to take a moment? Schiff's hidden hand twitched slightly in his lap beneath the desk. He shook his head precisely once, a movement so agonizingly slow and almost imperceptible that only the high-definition cameras managed to catch the tragic gesture of complete surrender. Goldberg looked deeply at Joy Behar, then at Sunny Hostin, then at Sarah Haynes. Not a single co-host uttered a solitary word to defend their fallen champion. Goldberg smoothly rotated her gaze back to the glowing red light of the center camera. When she spoke, her voice was the polished, deeply comforting instrument she had expertly utilized on this exact broadcast for 16 highly successful years. The warm, inviting host of a comfortable American living room. We are going to take a commercial break, Goldberg announced flawlessly. The seasoned director immediately cut the live feed to a scheduled commercial block. In the massive brightly lit room, the studio audience absolutely did not applaud. The studio audience absolutely did not boo. 300 deeply progressive women simply sat trapped in the profound, heavy silence of people who had happily walked into a television studio that Tuesday morning entirely convinced they were going to loudly celebrate one very specific political reality, only to discover they had just witnessed the brutal, systemic destruction of a completely different one. When the live broadcast of The View finally returned from the agonizingly long 4-minute commercial break, the visual reality of the studio had not altered one iota. Senator Adam Schiff was still firmly planted in his guest chair. He had not angrily left the set. He had not defiantly stood up. He had not even managed the basic motor function required to pick up his expensive pen. He had simply sat there, utterly immobilized through the entire agonizing duration of the commercial break, his head bowed heavily, his defeated hands resting entirely out of sight in his lap. Whoopi Goldberg fundamentally altered the dynamic. She absolutely refused to return her attention to the broken man beside her. She did not offer him a lifeline, nor did she ask him another humiliating question. Instead, she turned her entire physical focus squarely onto Senator John Kennedy. "Senator, would you like to make a closing statement?" Goldberg asked respectfully. Kennedy explicitly chose not to stand for his final address. He did not raise his deep, gravelly voice for theatrical effect. He spoke softly to Whoopi, directly to the silenced audience, and into the unblinking broadcast cameras with the profound, grounded intimacy of an older man speaking across his neighbor's kitchen table when an incredibly difficult, deeply unavoidable conversation about unacceptable behavior finally had to occur. "Whoopi, I appreciate the chance." "I am sorry that the segment had to take this turn," Kennedy began softly, his tone laced with genuine, surprising regret. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone. I came here because the network invited me. They thought I might be a contrast to Senator Schiff." He slowly, deliberately waved his worn hand across the 5 devastating folders resting open on the table. "I did not know when I packed this briefcase last night in my hotel room that we would end up where we are." His voice hardened slightly, grounding himself in the absolute facts. "But ma'am, I did not bring nothing to this stage that was not already public. The mortgage referral is public. The TV transcripts are public. The Mueller report is public. The Durham report is public. The censure resolution is public. The parody transcript is in the congressional record." Kennedy looked around the desk, locking eyes with the profoundly silent hosts. "Every receipt I read out today was sitting in plain view. The country's been able to see it for years. The newspapers chose not to cover it. The networks chose not to ask about it." And men like Senator Schiff went on telling the country one thing while the record said another. He dramatically pivoted his entire upper body to directly face the stunned crowd of 300 progressive Manhattan women. "Folks, I know I am not your favorite kind of senator," Kennedy admitted plainly. "I know I am from Louisiana. I know I have an accent. I know I voted against many things you support." He offered a small, deeply respectful nod. "That is fine. That is what democracy looks like. We disagree. Then we get up the next morning and we keep working." Kennedy let a beat of silence pass. But what we just witnessed, that is something different. That is what happens when a public servant treats the American people like they cannot read. His voice rose with steady, undeniable conviction, like they cannot read a financial disclosure, like they cannot read a Mueller report, like they cannot read an inspector general's memo. Senator Schiff went on television for 9 years telling the American people things he knew were not true. And when he was finally asked, under no oath on a daytime show in front of a friendly audience, to defend it, he could not. Senator John Kennedy delivered his final, devastating blow, not with anger, but with profound sincerity. Looking directly at the daytime hosts and the live studio audience, he pleaded with them to demand the absolute truth from their leaders, regardless of political party. With his heavy, beaten-up briefcase securely in hand, he warmly invited the panel to Louisiana for a local crawfish boil, bid them farewell, and calmly walked off the brightly lit set. What followed was a moment of unprecedented television history. All 300 fiercely progressive women in the audience rose to their feet, delivering a roaring, nearly 3-minute standing ovation for the conservative country lawyer. Left behind in the deafening applause was Adam Schiff, utterly paralyzed and broken in his chair, his expensive pen abandoned on the studio floor. The political fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic for the Washington establishment. The raw broadcast clip went viral within minutes, becoming the defining image of the year and sending Schiff's career into a complete tailspin. Within days, a federal grand jury was impaneled. Schiff suspended his media appearances. His highly promoted book plummeted off the bestseller list, and his former media allies quietly distanced themselves from the wreckage. Kennedy, however, simply boarded a flight home to the humid, timeless embrace of Madisonville, Louisiana, refusing to give a single follow-up interview. He knew the undeniable federal receipts he had presented spoke perfectly for themselves. Sitting peacefully on his weathered back porch above the slow-moving Tchefuncte River, Kennedy prepared a crawfish boil with his cousin, completely unbothered by the media storm. When a young, ambitious reporter finally tracked the senator down to ask what America had just witnessed on that Manhattan stage, Kennedy's answer was razor sharp. The country didn't see a debate problem. They saw a profound character problem exposed entirely by the government's own meticulous records. The cynical Washington model of partisan lies and media protection had been systematically dismantled in 60 minutes by an old man with 5 simple folders. But the political reckoning is far from over. As the Louisiana sun sets, the true danger for the political elite remains securely locked inside that battered leather case sitting quietly on Kennedy's porch. If you want to discover the explosive secrets and undeniable receipts still hidden inside Senator Kennedy's completely unopened folders, smash that subscribe button, leave a comment below, and turn on your notifications, because the truth is coming, and you absolutely will not want to miss what we reveal in our next video.